You got the contract. You thought the hard part was over. And then you hear, the buyer wants to cancel. Wait, what? How does that happen? When the house looked great, the photos were done, the offer came in, and everything seemed to be moving forward. You know, that's exactly what more sellers are running into right now. And a lot of it could have been spotted and prevented before the home ever went on the market. I'm dealing with avoiding this situation with my seller for a home I'm getting ready to list. We're not on the market quite yet, but we are walking through the house asking very different questions than most sellers ask. Not just, does this look good enough to list, but what could come back and bite us later? Because that's the real issue. Not every problem stops a sale, but the wrong surprise at the wrong time absolutely can. And that's where sellers get caught. For example, in this Morrison house, we found a couple of broken windows after the seller had already vacated. Now, are windows the end of the world? No. But are they the kind of thing a buyer could notice, question, and use it to start pulling on a thread of what else might be wrong with this house? Absolutely. So now the question becomes, do we wait and let the buyer bring it up later when emotions are higher and the clock is ticking and everyone's under pressure? Or do we build a strategy around it now? That doesn't always mean fixing everything you find before you list. Sometimes it means addressing it up front, minimizing how it shows, being honest about it, and deciding in advance how you'll handle it if or when it comes up. And that's very different from getting blindsided after you already have a contract in hand. Because here's the reality. A contract isn't the finish line. It's when the buyer starts digging in. And that's where things can get expensive, especially if something comes up that you weren't prepared for. Today's buyers are looking at homes very differently than they used to. You know, in the past, buyers seemed to be a whole lot more flexible. They understood that homes weren't perfect and that they might have to deal with some things after the closing. And in a lot of cases, they were okay with that, as long as the safety issues were addressed and the location matched what they were looking for. But that's not what I'm seeing today. Today's buyers are walking into a home and they're already starting to do the math. They're looking at the price. They're looking at the interest rate. They're looking at insurance costs. And then they start trying to estimate what repairs might cost them. And in a lot of cases, they overestimate. And now they're trying to figure out what this home is really going to cost them, not just to buy, but to actually live in. So when something comes up, even something that feels small to you as a seller, they're not brushing it off. They're asking, is this something I have to deal with right away? How much is this going to cost me? And what else might I be missing? And if they don't feel confident in those answers, they're not moving forward the way they used to. They're either asking for more during inspection, or they're asking for concessions, or in some cases, they're just walking away. And that's the part that's catching sellers off guard. Because from a seller's perspective, everything felt fine. The home showed well. It got attention. Heck, it even got an offer. And then the buyer starts digging in, which is exactly why with this Morrison home, we're not just preparing it to show well. We're preparing it for what happens after the contract comes in. Because this is where I see the difference between a sale that moves forward and one that starts to fall apart. It's not that one home is perfect and the other isn't. It's that one seller has taken the time to think through what might come up before they're in the middle of it. For example, with a listing preparation, we're not assuming everything needs to be fixed, but we are asking, what could a buyer question here? What might come up during inspection? How can we position this home so the buyer feels like it's close to move-in ready as possible? And how do we handle any situation that might come up before we're under pressure? Because once you're under contract, everything speeds up quickly. Now you're on a timeline. You're negotiating. You're making decisions that affect real money. And if you haven't thought through those things ahead of time, you're not deciding anymore. You're just reacting. And that's where I see people either agree to things they didn't expect or push back on something that ends up costing them the deal. So what we're doing instead is deciding ahead of time what condition the home is really in. What are we comfortable addressing before we list? And what would we rather handle through negotiation if or when it comes up? Because when you've already made those decisions, it doesn't feel like a problem later. It simply becomes a conversation. And that's a very different experience than feeling like you're trying to figure it out in the middle of everything else you're doing. This is also why getting your home ready to look good is not the same as getting it ready to sell. Because the goal isn't just to get an offer. It's to get all the way through the process without things coming undone along the way. So if you're starting to think about selling and you want to avoid being in that situation where you're trying to figure things out under pressure, taking a little time at the front end really pays off. I recently put together a blog that goes deeper into what buyers are really paying attention to right now, especially when it comes to condition, inspections, and things that can come up later. I'll link that below for you. Because once you start looking at it this way, the next thing you're going to want to understand is what actually happens after you go under contract. Because that's where deals start to fall apart right now. Oh, and if we haven't met, hi, I'm Peggy Durstoff, a realtor with Live Denver Suburbs, powered by HomeSmart, and I help women over 50 make smart real estate moves without pressure and without regret, especially if they're doing it on their own. Now, if you've been thinking about selling, watch this video next. This is where most sellers get caught off guard. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you over there.